At the beginning of the 18th century, the Russian Empire was one of the largest empires in the world. In this era, most of the other European capitalist imperialist empires is spreading across the globe, ruled by monarchs who perpetuated slavery, genocide, and repression. They suppressed dissent through force and committed many atrocities. The Russian Empire was no different. At the beginning of the 20th century, Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty held complete control over the empire. Under his rule, people lived in poverty, with many existing under serfdom, a system akin to slavery. But as the world entered the second half of the 19th century, industrialization began, leading to the creation of factories. This marked the start of industrial capitalism, pushing the world into modernity. However, industrialization also created a distinct class divide of factory workers and factory owners. Most factory owners acquired their wealth through inheritance, allowing them to establish factories. In this climate, German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels suggested that capitalism would lead to a growing divide between the working class and the capitalist class, with the rich becoming richer at the expense of the working people. They believed this division would result in a social revolution, redistributing wealth and ultimately creating communism, a classless, stateless, and humane society based on common ownership, where each person gives what they can and takes what they need. This idea spread across Europe, but ultimately failed as authoritarian monarchies clamped down on the people's will and suppressed the masses with force, causing widespread suffering. Russia was no different. Many people were bound to work the land under a system of serfdom, which was officially abolished in 1861. This was not due to the benevolence of the Tsar, but because the Tsar recognized the need to industrialize, which require labor to be exploited by capital. This led to a significant new working class moving into the cities of Russia. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was formed to unite various revolutionary groups who was dissatisfied with the Tsar. Russia deemed this illegal, so these meetings often took place in various Western European cities to discuss aiding the people and creating a communist utopia. But divisions within this party, mainly between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, who believed that a true communist revolution could only succeed with the strong leadership of one person or a small select few, faced criticism by Menshevik leader Julius Martov, who disagreed with Lenin, causing a split. Lenin spent most of his time in Western Europe, writing Marxist publications and meeting with fellow socialists to spread the message of communism. Many people were frustrated with the Tsar's failure to modernize Russia. They feel he was too controlling and had dragged the Russian people into a war with Japan, which resulted in an embarrassing defeat. Mass protests erupted in the capital, St. Petersburg. The Tsar responded by massacring the protesters with the Imperial Guard, sparking the 1905 revolution. Various workers' councils, or Soviets, were established to organize and coordinate the protests and revolution. Workers and some military personnel led a crippling general strike against the Tsar. This resulted in the Russian Empire becoming a constitutional monarchy and the establishment of the State Duma, the first elected parliament of Russia. However, Tsar Nicholas II did his best to limit the parliament's power and maintain crown authority. He could elect his own ministers and dissolve the State Duma for re-election whenever he wanted, which he did in 1906. As time passed, the conditions of the Russian Empire continued to evolve. Russia saw increased urbanization and industrialization, which allowed communist ideas to spread and show the people what the world could be if they were not oppressed by those at the top. During this time, farmers also wanted to own the land they worked on, as they felt they were being exploited by the nobility. Meanwhile, people in the cities faced overcrowding and sanitation problems, leaving them yearning for a better way of life. In this period, Lenin briefly returned to Russia to help the Bolsheviks raise funds, but Tsar Nicholas clamped down and arrested many revolutionaries. Lenin fled and stayed away from authoritarian Russia for many years, settling in Switzerland and spreading the word of the revolution. Following this, a great event happened in 1914, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. As Russia was allied with Serbia, it declared war on Austria-Hungary, prompting Germany, their ally, to declare war on Russia. This ignited World War I, where the proletariat was forced to fight a petty squabble of the nobility and bourgeoisie. Tsar Nicholas believed that war would unite the people of the Russian Empire against an old enemy and distract them from harsh living conditions. The people were blinded by nationalism and racism, with a wave of nationalism sweeping through the populace. St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd due to its German association. Russia's trade routes through the Ottoman Empire were cut off, leading to an economic crisis. The government resorted to printing more money to pay for the war, resulting in inflation. The cost of living rose, yet farmers were not adequately compensated for their produce, leading them to grow crops solely for themselves and causing food shortages in cities. By 1915, people were angry at the government's handling of affairs. Tsar Nicholas took charge of running the war to boost national morale, but proved ineffective. He left his wife, Empress Alexandra Fedorovna, to manage the government in Petrograd. However, she constantly replaced government ministers, leading to government instability. The Russian people also disliked Alexandra due to her German heritage and her close association with the mystic Grigory Rasputin. Troops on the front lines lacked proper munitions due to the struggling economy, and industry faltered due to lack of funding. Socialists saw this imperialist war as an opportunity to unite the working people, who were being used as cannon fodder, and overthrow the monarchies of Europe, creating a communist utopia. At the beginning of the war, More skilled workers were conscripted to the front lines, and even the military grew tired of the Tsar's handling of the situation. The better supplied German forces inflicted heavy losses on the Russian forces, awakening the army to the causes of the working class. Peasants found themselves promoted to officers as casualties mounted. The hopelessness of the war led to widespread desertions and revolutionary propaganda-fueled strikes. In early 1916, the State Duma warned Nicholas that he needed to form a new government to address the issues, but he ignored this, further alienating many nobles. Tired of Rasputin's influence over Empress Alexandra, he was assassinated in late 1916. By the end of the year, political instability reached a boiling point. Many nobles and politicians suggested that Nicholas relieve Alexandra of her power. When he refused, they realized that the Tsar himself was the problem. Protests erupted in Petrograd, with the government responding by rationing flour and bread, sparking bread riots. Factories went on strike in solidarity, and women celebrated International Women's Day, which evolved into the February Revolution. Although it occurred in March according to the Gregorian calendar due to the use of the old Julian calendar, Nicholas, on his way to oversee the war, ordered the military to control the protests by force if necessary. Prime Minister Nikolai Guchkov announced that the government would be dissolved until April. Some soldiers clashed with protesters while others mutinied and joined the rebellion. The system was crumbling fast. The next day, much of the military had mutinied and joined the rebellion, hunting down police and gathering weapons. A provisional committee of the State Duma was set up as a potential replacement for the government to restore law and order, ultimately aiming to end the war against Germany. The Russian Empire underwent significant upheaval. On the same day, the Petrograd Soviet was re-established by the Socialists, and the Council of Ministers of Russia resigned, giving control of the capital to the revolutionaries. Mikhail Rodzianko, chairman of the Duma, invited 3 Grand Dukes to sign a grand manifesto urging Nicholas II to introduce a constitutional system. As Nicholas traveled back to Petrograd, soldiers guarding the imperial palace at Tsarskoye Selo abandoned their posts. His advisers suggested he abdicate the throne, which he ultimately did, naming his brother as heir. However, his brother declined the offer, realizing its unpopularity. During the chaos, some individuals dug up Rasputin's body and burned it. An alliance of liberals and socialists established a new government to organize elections for a democratically elected government. The royal family was placed under protective custody by the new provisional government. The Soviet, however, refused to join the government, holding real power over the people and the military. They shared power for a time, with the Soviet having the final say in developments. The Russian Empire was reorganized into the Russian Republic during the week of the February Revolution. Lenin saw this as the perfect opportunity to return to Russia. In July, after a disastrous Russian offensive against the Central Powers, 500,000 people, including soldiers and sailors, protested in Petrograd, dissatisfied with the lack of change since February. Lenin and the Bolsheviks supported the protest. However, the corrupt provisional government interpreted it as a Bolshevik coup and called for the arrest of many prominent Bolsheviks. Lenin fled to Finland while another prominent Bolshevik, Leon Trotsky, was arrested. In August, General Lav Kornilov ordered an army towards Petrograd to restore law and order. Fearing a coup, Kerensky ordered them to stop. Kerensky then turned to the Petrograd Soviet for help, trying to calm things down with the army's assistance. But as this happened, the Bolsheviks, who represented the people's interests, had been steadily growing in popularity, overtaking the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. In September, the Petrograd Soviet released all Bolshevik prisoners, including Trotsky, who became chairman. People on the ground were unhappy with the government, and workers across various industries organized Soviets, taking control of their means of production. The hammer and sickle symbol emerged, representing industrial and agricultural workers, respectively. Lenin saw it was time to act and returned to Petrograd. The Bolsheviks' military council, led by Trotsky, began planning a proper armed uprising. With the Soviets controlling much of the military and railways, Petrograd and the provisional government were isolated. The Bolsheviks made their plans public to maximize participation, starting the October Revolution on October 25th of the Julian calendar. Pro-Bolshevik navy supported the uprising, and the Red Guards captured key points throughout the city. Kerensky fled the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was based, seeking reinforcements. Lenin proclaimed the overthrow of the provisional government by the Soviets, aiming for a peaceful transfer of power. As forces closed in on the Winter Palace, the revolution remained relatively bloodless as the Bolsheviks delayed a full assault. Eventually, those guarding the Winter Palace abandoned their posts, and it was captured by the Soviets, forcing the provisional government to surrender. However, the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks walked out in protest, believing it was too much of a power grab. Lenin became the leader of the government, winning over many people. Kerensky arrived at Tsarskoye Selo with anti-revolutionary Cossacks, firing upon Russian troops, further turning them against him. The old government dissolved, marking the end of the revolution, though its impacts were just beginning. Lenin swiftly moved to end Russia's involvement in the European War. The imperialist German Empire imposed harsh terms on this fragile republic, leading to a civil war as capitalist imperial nations attempted to crush the People's Revolution. The Bolsheviks faced a civil war against the Whites, with the Reds controlling the industrial heartland and the Whites dominating rural areas. In the face of White forces, the Communists were forced to eliminate the entire Romanov family to safeguard the new socialist republic. Eventually, the Bolsheviks managed to push out the imperialist-backed White Army, transforming Russia into the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, nationalizing land and industry for the people, marking the establishment of the first constitutional socialist state. The capital also shifted to Moscow, and Lenin then initiated the Communist project. The imperialist Russian state and its consequences left Russia in ruins. Famine ravaged the land, with 5 million people starving to death. Massive inflation, infrastructure destruction, diseases, and epidemics claimed millions of lives, causing life expectancy to plummet. People struggled to survive, facing freezing conditions and a lack of education. Lenin worked tirelessly day and night to salvage the new socialist republic. However, he tragically passed away from a stroke. Stalin, one of his trusted fellow revolutionaries, rose to power in the aftermath. Under Stalin's leadership, the agrarian Soviet Union transitioned towards modernity and industrialization. Iron, coal, steel, and heavy industry saw massive increases. Stalin initiated the collectivization of Russian farms, implemented universal housing, and eradicated unemployment. Unlike other nations, the Russian state remained relatively unaffected by the Great Depression. Stalin also purged the state of anti-revolutionaries and those deemed threats to the revolution, expanding Russian influence as he stabilized Russia. The country emerged as a growing power, transforming from a backward nation to one with significant influence. However, new adversaries emerged aiming to undermine the prosperity of the working class. After losing World War I, Germany elected the Nazi Party into power. Germany was one of the wealthiest nations at the time due to the massive wealth generated by workers in the mines and factories in the Rhineland. The Nazis dissolved the parliament to protect the interests of German industrialists in the face of a potential socialist revolution. Stalin and the Soviet leadership recognized that war with Germany was inevitable. From this point on, the fascists consistently blamed Bolshevism for global issues and vowed to rid the world of socialism. They allied with capitalist industrialists, suppressed unions, and sent prominent leftists to concentration camps. Leftists viewed fascism as a variant of capitalism,
seeing it as an attempt by the capitalist ruling class to survive against a popular socialist revolution and to destroy socialism using any means necessary. Given this context, it was clear to everyone that a war between the fascists and the Soviets would break out. The Soviets needed to buy time, knowing they could defeat Germany by 1943. Therefore, it was crucial for them not to be attacked before then. The German fascists faced a similar dilemma. They aimed to spread fascism to all nations to create a larger alliance against the Soviet Union. To achieve this, they needed to conquer other capitalist states. While they assumed they could defeat France and believed they could overcome Britain, they knew they would lose against the great Soviets if they attacked. While committing war crimes in France, the plan was indeed to make peace with the Soviets, then turn on France and the UK, followed by throwing the entire weight of their army and those of other capitalists against the Soviet Union. Despite both being capitalist, the Western Allies and Germany were enemies because they represented different forms of capitalism. Hitler's capitalism revolved around state control to prevent socialist uprisings, while the Western Allies were more inclined towards individual rights and democracy, albeit within a bourgeois framework. This difference stemmed partly from the colonialist legacy of the UK, which allowed for wealth and freedom at home. The Nazis proposed a partition of Poland to the Soviets, offering them land lost after World War I in exchange for peace. The USSR accepted the deal not out of imperialist intentions or friendship with fascists, but because they were not ready for war and faced the threat of annihilation from the fascists. Stalin understood the inevitability of war and sought to delay it to gain maximum advantage. While the Germans initially led in production, by the end of the war, because of the efficiency of the command economy, the Soviets had 4 times the army size. Thus, they were unprepared for invasion due to economic factors rather than any affinity with fascism. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced with experienced fascist forces swarming the Soviet borders. The Soviet army was not yet ready to repel them, facing a situation akin to locusts feasting on grain. The capitalist and fascist forces indeed engaged in widespread burning, looting, and atrocities against the population, including the execution of Soviet prisoners for their party affiliations. The fascist strategy, known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, aimed to quickly break through enemy lines, capture the capital, and force a swift surrender. However, the Nazis underestimated the determination of the Soviet people. While the Red Army suffered losses and was encircled, they managed to slow down the German advance until winter. The Soviet Union signed a new neutrality pact with Japan to shift specialized winter fighting troops from Siberia to defend the heartland, which was crucial as these troops were adept at winter warfare. Germany's focus shifted to the oil fields in the Caucasus due to dwindling oil supplies, abandoning their original tactics. This transition to a long war of attrition played to the advantage of the massive Soviet industry and population. The Red Army, however, misjudged the German strategy, deploying troops in the wrong place and allowing them to advance far beyond their supply lines, even reaching the Volga River and Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad became a pivotal moment, with both sides determined to win. The Soviets implemented the no-step-back order to prevent officers from retreating against orders, but soldiers were allowed to return to their lines if attacks failed. The battle dragged on through the winter, with both sides sending in reinforcements. By February 1943, both sides had over 1 million men in the city, but the Soviets gained an advantage with more artillery and aircraft. The turning point came when the Soviets launched a counterattack, encircling Stalingrad and cutting off German supplies. Despite attempts to resupply via air, German resistance crumbled, and by the end of 1943, thanks to the determination of Soviet soldiers, the front line had moved back towards Germany. This marked the famous German phrase, taktische Frontverlegung, meaning tactical operation for shortening the front line, which essentially meant a retreat without admitting defeat. In 1943, the largest tank battle in history occurred at Kursk, where the Soviets proved to be completely superior, having 3 times the soldiers and twice the tanks. Predictably, The fascists lost this battle. By 1944, the Soviets had reclaimed all of Eastern Europe, while Western Europe and Italy fell to the capitalist Allies. Hitler's suicide in Berlin marked the end of the war in Europe, with the main generals of the Wehrmacht formally surrendering to the Allies. The war in Asia continued for a few more weeks until the Soviet Union crossed the border of Manchuria, advancing halfway through Korea before Japan surrendered after being bombed by the capitalist West twice. Post-war borders were agreed upon at the Yalta Conference, with the USSR receiving the largest area due to its significant contributions to the war effort. However, despite working together to defeat fascism, the USSR and the liberal capitalist West quickly became rivals as capitalism and socialism could not coexist peacefully. After World War II, the Cold War began with the Soviet Union and the Western powers splitting Europe. The Soviet Union was tasked with rebuilding Eastern European countries, while the US, UK, and France focused on Western Europe. Germany, in particular, was divided between the USSR and the capitalist nations, with Berlin also being split. The Western nations implemented free market policies in their occupied territories, but these didn't initially yield significant results. To stimulate the economies, the US initiated the Marshall Plan, providing financial aid to European countries. However, this aid came with conditions, such as spending on US imports, effectively making the recipient nations reliant on American goods. Additionally, American capitalists and banks gained significant influence in Western European industries through acquisitions and loans. The US also used its political leverage to push for liberal free market economies in the occupied nations, effectively turning them into economic colonies or puppet states. When Germany was divided, the occupying powers agreed on certain conditions, including using a common currency to ease future reunification. However, the introduction of a new currency without consulting the Soviet Union led to tensions. The USSR felt marginalized, especially as the Soviet occupation zone lacked significant industrial resources compared to the Western zones. Stalin demanded access to the industrial region of Berlin for reparations, but when the Allies refused, he blockaded the city. The Berlin blockade marked the official beginning of the Cold War. The blockade was eventually lifted after about a year, but it underscored the growing divide between East and West. The capitalist powers established their own puppet state in their zones of occupation, leading Stalin to create the German Democratic Republic in the Soviet zone. Stalin proposed a unified democratic Germany under international supervision, but the Western nations rejected this offer out of fear of a socialist majority in Germany's elections. This refusal highlighted the ideological tensions between democracy and socialism during the early stages of the Cold War. The division of Europe into Eastern and Western spheres of influence led to heightened tensions and military preparations on both sides. Winston Churchill's Operation Unthinkable and the positioning of US bombers with nuclear bombs demonstrated the West's readiness for conflict with the Soviet Union. However, there were individuals in the United States who sympathized with the Soviet Union and leaked plans of nuclear bombs to them, leading to the USSR's successful testing of its first nuclear warhead in 1949. This marked the beginning of a nuclear arms race between the US and USSR throughout the Cold War. Meanwhile, in the United States, the fear of communism led to the persecution of suspected communists, with many losing their jobs or being arrested. Despite US claims of supporting freedom of expression, the US also escalated the Cold War by forming NATO, a military alliance aimed at containing the spread of communism and threatening the Soviet Union. In China, a civil war between the Communist People's Liberation Army, led by Mao Zedong, and the fascist Chinese Nationalist Party ended with the victory of the Communists. The Nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan. In Korea, both the US and USSR installed temporary local leaders, but tensions rose when the US made it clear that a united Korea would be capitalist. This led to anxiety in North Korea, which saw the South as occupied territory and initiated a liberation war against the dictatorship in the South. The conflict escalated as capitalist nations supported the South Korean government, leading to Chinese intervention with 500,000 soldiers. The US considered using nuclear weapons against the Chinese forces, but refrained due to the fear of Soviet intervention. The Korean War ended with an armistice in 1953, leaving the Korean peninsula divided into North and South. South Korea underwent several US-backed fascist dictatorships until transitioning to a neoliberal democracy in 1987. In Germany, the economic systems of East and West were vastly different. West Germany, under a capitalist free market economy, received aid from the Marshall Plan, leading to economic growth. Meanwhile, East Germany operated under a centralized socialist economy, facing challenges in growth due to a lack of financial support and reparations to the Soviet Union. The US didn't have to rebuild because they were far away and not damaged by the war, so they didn't ask for reparations and gave aid to West Germany to be a propaganda state to make it seem that capitalism brings wealth. In contrast, the Soviet Union, which contributed blood and was ravaged by war, was still trying to recover and couldn't help much. The Berlin Wall was erected by East Germany to address issues of spying and defection. While criticized by capitalist nations, it served as a regular border with controlled crossings for specific purposes, allowing visits between East and West. Stalin had led the Soviet Union from an agrarian state to an industrialized nuclear power and the second strongest state in the world, with much better living conditions than other imperial states. The death of Stalin and subsequent leadership changes in the Soviet Union affected stability. America then created NATO, an aggressive move to threaten the USSR by imperialist capitalist states. To counter NATO, the Warsaw Pact was formed, focusing on countering capitalist aggression rather than threatening the USA. Both sides developed more advanced nuclear weapons and explored space exploration, with the USSR launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, leading to the Sputnik crisis in capitalist nations. The USA's efforts to catch up resulted in a failed rocket launch, highlighting the technological superiority of socialism. The space race between the USA and the Soviet Union intensified, with the USSR achieving several milestones ahead of the US, including sending the first living animal, Laika, into space and launching the first man, woman, and automated missions to space. In response, the US pledged to land on the Moon and eventually succeeded, claiming victory in the space race even though they only won one milestone. In Cuba, after the Cuban Revolution, the US attempted to invade but failed. Later, the aggressive USA placed nuclear weapons in Turkey to threaten the Soviet Union. The USSR then planned to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in retaliation, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis escalated tensions between the US and the USSR, with the world coming close to nuclear war after the US provoked with a submarine attack on a nation that was at peace with and violating international law. Eventually, a resolution was reached where the US removed nuclear missiles from Turkey, and the USSR agreed not to place missiles in Cuba. In Vietnam, after facing French imperialism, the country split after the Geneva Conference into North and South. Tensions escalated due to differing ideologies. The US intervened in the Vietnam War, fearing that a unified Vietnam would adopt communism. Despite technological superiority, the US faced strong resistance from Vietnamese guerrilla fighters armed with AK-47s. Eventually, the US withdrew from Vietnam, acknowledging defeat despite previous claims of victory. After the fall of the Southern government in Vietnam, the entire country became socialist. Similarly, in Afghanistan, a new socialist government, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, faced opposition from reactionary insurgencies and requested Soviet assistance. However, the USA supported anti-Soviet forces, including terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Eventually, the Soviet Union withdrew, leading to the fall of the socialist government and subsequent instability in Afghanistan. During the détente period of the Cold War, the USA and USSR signed the SALT Treaty to limit the production of nuclear weapons. However, Covert CIA operations continued to undermine socialist governments around the world, killing civilians and revolutionaries, often resulting in the installation of fascist regimes. Even though East Germans didn't want it, in the late 1980s, protests against the Berlin Wall led to its eventual dismantling. East Germans may have desired a more democratic socialist state with open borders to the West, but the reunification of Germany was driven by West German interests despite opposition from the majority of East Germans. This forced transition to capitalism had long-lasting negative effects on the East German states. Similar transitions from socialism to capitalism occurred in many countries because of CIA meddling, leading to significant social and economic changes across the socialist world. Then, Gorbachev came into power in the USSR, and he implemented perestroika and glasnost, which were policies that led to the collapse of the USSR. Essentially, he attempted some reforms but ended up destabilizing the socialist revolution in the process. The people still desired communism, but unfortunately, their desires were overridden as the nation was sold to Western capital. Then, the CIA intervened, creating the corrupt authoritarian state of modern Russia. This is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. What the Soviet Union left behind was a prospering nation with a highly educated populace, universal housing, 0% unemployment, and universal health care and education. Over time, Russia transformed from an agrarian society into the second global power. The socialist state didn't fall because of economic problems. Their economy was growing, albeit much slower than the West, as they prioritized quality of life over massive growth. However, communism was undermined by the imperialism of the capitalist world, leading to poverty, anarchy, unemployment, alcoholism, inflation, declining birth rates, and higher mortality rates under an authoritarian regime that ensured its will to forge capital. The state still struggles to recover to its pre-Soviet Union level. The story of the Soviet Union is a tragedy, as the